Welcome to Why Where Matters. My name is Paul E. Zieske, and this is a place where we tackle the complex world of location-based services using a concept called enterprise traffic control. Before we dig into what enterprise traffic control is, or as we call it in healthcare, care traffic control, I think it's important to get into some background on the market and the industry in general. I thought we should start out with the location-based services 101. Now, location-based services is so broad, we're not going to try and touch on every aspect of it. We'll distill it into the parts that we need for the traffic control concept. That's going to be a lot as it is. Even narrowing it was pretty long. So this is going to be a three-part series. And in part one, we'll talk about history and background, where we're going to talk about history, but we're also going to catch you up on where the industry and the market is today. Part 2 and 3, we will talk about use cases in the healthcare industry, and more specifically in the hospitals, because that's where most of the motion is consolidated. And later, when we talk about care traffic control, you'll see why. Part 2 is about tracking property, and property means assets and supplies. Part 3 is going to be about use cases that are primarily tracking people. That could be patients, caregivers, or support services people. And I'm not going to go into specific solutions in location-based services 101 series. There's enough to talk about and just describing how the use cases work. So let's get into it. Let's start out with a little background in history. And the power of contextual data like location is almost incalculable. I started my career in radar in the 90s, so let's start with radar. And radar goes back to the 40s and really became famous when it failed to stop the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it turned out it wasn't the radar's fault, as it did indeed detect the incoming airplanes. It was the recognition that they were a threat that failed. And this is an example of the need for situational awareness and communications that will be an important part of this series. After Pearl Harbor, the systems were much more networked, the training was better, and communications improved. On September 1st, 1983, KAL Flight 007 left Anchorage, Alaska, en route to Seoul, South Korea. It went off course and it was shot down by a Soviet fighter, killing all 269 people on board. Soviets thought it was a spy plane, and it brought us very close to a conflict with them. If you want to get a better idea just how close, check out the Netflix documentary. It's playing now, and it's called Turning Point, The Bomb in the Cold War. And I remember it well because I was a young infantryman in the Army, and we were on high alert for several weeks after that event. There was no GPS, and there was no radar that far west of Anchorage back then. But that was until 1997, when I was a part of a team that put an ARSR, or Air Route Surveillance Radar, on an island called Shemya at the end of the Aleutian chain. It was a stone's throw away from the Eastern Hemisphere. It was also about 310 miles from Russia, and it looked into Russian airspace. The dates for that project are interesting because GPS was coming and coming fast. And this was in 1997, and they waited 14 years. Why didn't they just wait until GPS was live in 2000 and save the expense of putting a radar pretty much at the end of the earth? ADSB is a system where the airplane uses its GPS to send the location to the controllers. The reason they waited is that ADSB stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. It's dependent surveillance broadcast, meaning it's dependent on the aircraft having the system on board and the system being in working order. Radar is independent, as it bounces RF energy off the airplane and it listens for the return. You can't turn it off. The concept of dependent and independent surveillance is something we're going to work with in future episodes. And you'll start to see most location-based services really did start with aviation and space. You can't find information online about that ARSR radar, but do look up Cobra Dane. If you want to learn more about radar and that amazing place, that's a place to look. To be clear, I wasn't a part of the Cobra Dane, but it's a very cool piece of hardware that I paid close attention to. Cobra Dane was a radar that was installed in Shemya in 1997. It was used primarily for enforcement of the SALT II treaty and gathering intelligence on the ICBM program. It had a corollary mission for early warning and a secondary mission for space surveillance. It was a huge piece of equipment. It has what they call a single face phased array antenna. You can see where it's pointed directly at Russia. It's fixed in that position. Fixed is even a part of its designation, as it's an AN-FPS 108. AN is Army Navy, which is interesting because it was never operated by either the Army or the Navy. The FPS is fixed, pulsed, and the S is for search. The antenna is 95 feet in diameter, and it has an overall height of the radar is 120 feet, and it's quite a building. I wanted to point out Cobra Dane because it's extremely sensitive. It was in place in 1983, so why couldn't it have been used for the independent surveillance into the Russian airspace for aircraft? The reason is, even though it might be able to detect an airplane, it wasn't built for that, and there are other shortcomings that would make it not a good fit for that. It most certainly is a radar, but you wouldn't be able to trust it. And this is true for sensors in general, where specifications are critical to how they're used. When I was at Shemya, Raytheon was running the program, and I was lucky enough to get a tour of the facility. You could climb up behind the antenna and see each of the individual transmitters in the array. Now the facility has been transitioned to Space Force, which is pretty cool. Now, I can't mention Shemya without a few more fun facts. The Aleutian Islands are the only place where World War II was fought on American soil. It was a base for the attack in the Battle of Attu. Attu's in the Eastern Hemisphere, which means that Alaska has the most northern, eastern, and western points in the U.S. You can look that up. It's 1,200 miles from Anchorage, so it's over a 4-hour flight, commercial airline flight, and you're still in the same state. A flight from Detroit, as an example, flight from Detroit to Houston is only 1,100 miles. The Pacific Ocean is on one shore of the island, and the Arctic Ocean is on the other. A fun thing to do is to dip your toe in the Pacific Ocean and then run the short distance across the island and dip your toe in the Arctic Ocean, of course, if you dare, because the water's very cold. Before we bought Alaska from the Russians, they used to farm foxes on the island. There's still lots of blue fox running around. I can't end this topic without talking about a project that I worked on for most of the time that I was in Alaska. This goes back to a time when a lot of these innovations were driven by tragedies. In Alaska, you have the most airplanes per capita in the U.S. One of 127 people own an airplane. People fly in air taxis to get to many places because of the limited road system. And when you couple that with the size and terrain of Alaska, it's arguably the most complex place for small airplanes in the world. Then you add weather and realize that most of the aviation mishaps are caused by weather. And it's no surprise that Alaska also has the most small plane accidents per capita by a long stretch. It was around 1995. I know because it was before I arrived in Alaska. The FAA was seeing the internet become something that they thought they could leverage for their mission of air safety. They convened a committee to come up with ideas for things that could be done, and weather was a big topic. They found a PhD student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks who published an idea to use webcams for weather observation. He was basing his project on some technology that was being used in King County in Washington State for traffic cams. The committee could see the cams on the internet, so they saw it and they wanted to give it a try. And the pilots loved the idea because they often complained that the weather observation equipment was just wrong. And when it came to cloud cover, they didn't trust the system. So with cloud cover being the main culprit for what they call CFIT, and that's CFFIT, and that's controlled flight into terrain, which is probably the biggest euphemism ever in the long list of aviation euphemisms. They said if we could just see a camera image at the places where the weather equipment was located, it'd be a huge help. I'd been working on some software for our internet as a side project, and I put some things on the internet. So my boss asked me if I'd like to take a look at it. I was very excited to work on it, and I put 4 cams on top of the federal building and registered the domain akweathercams.com. The server could put the images on the internet without any additional software, but it had a very raw user interface. But you could see the images of the Chugach mountains clearly, and it was impressive even by today's standards. I sent an email to my point of contact at air traffic control, and they were over the moon. They wanted us to aggressively get the cameras out, and they would give us whatever we needed, and they picked the locations where we would try and find a place to put the cams. Sometimes I'd have to find space and power because FAA had no facilities in some of those locations, and that might mean I had to rent a helicopter and pilot to look around and find a tower or a suitable place for the cams. So this was one of those jobs where you're a little embarrassed that they're paying you. I was able to get many of the sites installed and built a website with a map that the users could click on each of the camera sites to get them up on the computer screen. Here we have Haines, which is an important point for tourists because it's the only place in the Inside Passage you can get to by car. What you see here is a much more refined version of the system, but a lot of the concept is exactly the way it was in 1998. I added the idea of using the cleared image next to the webcam with the annotations for the height of the mountains on the image. If there are clouds, you can estimate the cloud ceiling, and it turned out, along with the private pilots, the dispatchers at the air taxis would use them for go, no-go decisions. And I was later told that the site was saving lives. So this is an example of cameras as part of a distributed sensor network. When you can use a camera to extend what your human senses can do, that camera is a sensor. You can see that the site has expanded dramatically since 1998. It's almost nationwide now. This is Dutch Harbor, and people will remember this from the series The Deadliest Catch. This is a flight-aware site that interestingly uses the ADS-B system that we talked about earlier. We can see a huge amount of traffic in the air right now and look at the route from Seoul to South Korea and see how they're all neatly lined up for the most part. Of course, if we can see that, the controller can, because they're likely the reason that the traffic is so neatly organized. This all comes back to situational awareness and the value of simply extending the capabilities of our human senses with these types of systems. Cameras are indeed sensors, and there's a great deal of automation that we can add to the situational awareness that they provide. You start to see most location-based services really did start in aviation and space. And if you weren't convinced that location-based services are important, think about the billions of dollars that were spent on the GPS satellite network by the United States government, then the billions of dollars that GPS technologies put back into the economy from the products and services that have been created by the GPS. Some of us were around before GPS and remember what it was like to unfold a map and plot your road trip. These maps were folded in strange ways, and sometimes you felt like you were undoing someone's origami with no hope of ever getting it back to the way you found it. If you like to travel in your car, the glove box would typically be filled with these maps. The closest thing to an innovation was when AAA insurance company created something they called a triptych. You'd give them where you wanted to start and your destination, and you drive up to the local AAA office, and they'd hand you a bound stack of maps that were the segments of your trip, and you'd flip through the maps as you made your way down the interstate. Now, no more unfolding your map and drawing your route on it. As I said before, I was in the Army in the early 80s, and we had to navigate using only a map and a compass. It was a skill you needed to survive as a soldier, and it's not easy, and people did get lost, like really lost. I think these days, with technology, people can't even remember the last time that they really got lost like that. panicky, feeling lost, like 5 years old in the department store lost. And I remember during the 90s using GPS when it first came out. We had these expensive Garmin devices that were huge, and they were only accurate to about 50 meters, and we loved it. Military had access to these more accurate versions of the system, but civilians got what they called selective availability, so it wasn't as accurate. There were no cell phones, at least not that people could afford, nor were there any smartwatches. And then in 2000, they turned selective availability off, and it was instantly more accurate to within meters. But that was only the start. Eventually, we got our smartphones, and the cell phone towers became a part of the way location was calculated. And the accuracy improved more and more, and everything took off from there. Now we're pretty much dependent on it. Moving on to GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. It's less familiar than GPS. GIS is all around us as well. The maps that we use in our cars and our mobile devices and computers are all GIS, and even the map that I have on my bicycle. GIS and GPS are very much dependent on good maps. This isn't another industry that has its roots back to the 60s and really didn't see the consumer world until the dawn of the internet, but the combination with the internet, GPS, and GIS was an explosion in new product development, and maybe even a second wave with mobile and nanotech. So my appreciation with GIS came when I realized how much more GIS is than just maps. When I learned about geospatial processing and analytics, I knew this is technology I wanted to start working with. With geospatial science, you can attack problems in motion and delay, and it's the things that go on behind the maps that you see on the screen. Now we have tools like Waze, Uber, fitness apps, Google Earth, and of course, Google and Apple Maps, and they're adding new features all the time. Behind the scenes, they're using GIS tools like Esri. When people ask me what's Esri, I say Esri is the AutoCAD for maps. Of course, that's my engineer nerd answer. So it's a tool for building maps, like AutoCAD is a tool for building architectural drawings. More on the cutting edge are things like augmented reality. We all got a sense of what that is with the sensation that Pokemon Go game was for the short time that it was a sensation. Digital maps are a part of our lives just as much as GPS. And we depend on the amazing user experience and the features that they provide. GIS and GPS are the obvious location-based services, but there's so many more less obvious location services. When we check out at Walmart and they scan the tags on the items that we buy, that's location-based services. But those tags do much more than loss prevention. They're part of a much more sophisticated inventory management strategy. RFID was in reaction to a reported $3 billion sales loss that Walmart experienced in 2013, and that was due to poor inventory management. Theft was only a portion of the loss. This was early on when these technologies were usually a reaction to a large business problem that popped up. And I remember when we first started using what they called chips for tracking us when we ran in these road races like 5Ks. Eventually the tech improved so much that my family could track my progress when I was doing an Ironman triathlon that covered 140.6 miles. And that's more location-based services. When Amazon drops a package at your door and you see the exact time, location, and picture of the package, that's what they call track and trace, which is location-based services. Don't forget about the dispatcher having your exact location when you call 911. Location-based services. These are just some of the location-based services that we see in our daily lives, but when it comes to industry, there are many more. Now there's Industry 4.0, which they call the fourth industrial revolution. It has an architecture with cloud computing, AI, analytics, IoT, and something called digital twin that we'll talk more about later. I wanted to call out Industry 4.0 because it points out that location sensors are part of a greater ecosystem that's used to drive situational awareness and automation. You'll see that in Industry 4.0, but in healthcare, we don't have anything like Industry 4.0 because we think of industry as manufacturing. Lean and Six Sigma have helped with process improvement, and they've been brought from manufacturing to healthcare, but automation mindset that you see in manufacturing hasn't come along with it. I want to call that out because Care Traffic Control is aiming to change that. As we look at the use cases, you'll see the same underlying technology, but most of the use cases tilt towards situational awareness, and the automation is thin or non-existent. More of these location services are coming indoors, and that's having an effect on the whole ecosystem. Real-time locator system, or RTLS, is like RFID, but the tags use batteries. And that allows the tracking to be done in more locations in a building. And this has driven the need for better indoor maps. I say that, but there's a debate out there about the value of maps, and we'll dig into that as things move forward. Another thing that's changing the ecosystem is indoor positioning, which works like an indoor GPS. It gives a mobile device like a smartphone the ability to know its location and report it to other devices if needed. And this drives the need for better maps as well. There's little debate that you need good maps for indoor positioning, but that's nuanced as well. RFID and RTLS are mostly now falling into the category of IoT, which is Internet of Things. And all of this means that we can track the location of people and property indoors and outdoors, but this is why where it matters. So let's look at what we can do with the information. When you learn that RTLS allows us to cover more of a building with the tracking, you might ask, why don't we just use RTLS for everything? Well, there are two constraints that we have with RTLS. And as we've seen with any sensors, they have limitations. For RTLS, you need batteries for the tags. Where there are batteries, there's maintenance. And you do have to change the batteries at some point or replace the tag entirely. And I call this dependent surveillance. Second, the cost of the tags can be up to about $40 per tag. So you find limitations on what you can track. The cost of the sensors that are used to locate the tags are quite reasonable. I'm citing Bluetooth beacons for this discussion. With RFID, it's the opposite situation where the tags are very inexpensive, most of the time under $1, but it's the cost of the sensors that's much higher than RTLS. And those sensors are called exciters. Because they excite the tag to respond back to the system when they're hit with an RF signal, a radio frequency signal from the sensor. And I like to think of this as ringing a bell. Gets hit with RF and then it sends that back. It's also not dependent on batteries, so I'm going to call it independent surveillance. When you net it out, the total cost of RFID is too high to provide wall-to-wall, top-to-bottom coverage, but the cost of the tagging, most if not all of your mobile equipment is reasonable. Then the cost of RTLS is, let's say, reasonable for the wall-to-wall, top-to-bottom coverage, but the cost of tagging everything is too high. What this means is that it comes down to use cases and getting precise about what you're trying to do with the technology. This is where matters is really going to help. Many projects have struggled with ROI, and sometimes that's unnecessarily so. When we understand more about these use cases, we can be more efficient when we're looking at the greater market for these products. That was our background and history part of the 3-part Location-Based Services 101. Next, we'll take a look at tracking property. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting, and thanks so much.